I knew something was off the moment my dog, Rocco, started barking his head off at 2 in the morning. He's a lazy old mutt who barely lifts his head for squirrels anymore, so when he stood at the back door growling like he was ready to tear someone's ankle off, I grabbed my flashlight and headed outside. That's when I saw them 3 figures creeping along the side of my house with flashlights. I ducked behind the grill and clicked my own light on. When I caught their faces, I nearly laughed out loud. There she was, the queen of petty herself, Gloria Hartley, the HOA president, with her 2 loyal stooges, Lyle and Deanne, scanning my backyard like they were casing the place. Gloria's nasal voice cut through the night. "I told you he's hiding something. No one builds a shed without prior approval. It's probably non-compliant." It wasn't a shed, it was a smokehouse. I built it last week and it was well within code. I even submitted the paperwork, but of course Gloria didn't receive it. Typical HOA nonsense. I stepped out from the shadows. "You know it's illegal to trespass, right?" Gloria nearly jumped out of her orthopedic sneakers. "Elliot, you startled me." "No kidding. Want to explain why you're sneaking around my house in the middle of the night with flashlights? You couldn't just knock on my door during daylight like a normal person." Lyle muttered something about routine inspection, while Deanne looked like she wanted to evaporate. "You didn't respond to our second notice," Gloria snapped, adjusting her ridiculous pearl necklace like that made her legit. "We had reason to believe you were in violation." "At 2 in the morning, I asked. "You do realize I have the whole thing on my security cams, right?" They froze. I crossed my arms. "You've got about 5 seconds to get off my property before I call the cops." They hustled back through the side gate, Gloria's voice trailing off. "You'll be hearing from the board." I stood there for a minute, fuming. This wasn't the first time they'd pulled something shady. But I was done playing nice. If Gloria wanted a violation war, I was going scorched earth. The next morning, I drove straight to the hardware store and picked up motion sensors, floodlights, and a set of sirens loud enough to wake the next zip code. I spent the entire weekend wiring them up around the smokehouse, the driveway, and the backyard fence line. I even put a small sign out front. "Smile, you're being recorded." Rocco watched me from the porch, tail wagging like he knew exactly what was coming. They wanted a show. I was about to give them one. By Tuesday evening, the street outside my house looked like a hardware catalog exploded on my lawn, bright halogen floodlights wired along the eaves, motion sensors tucked under the roofline, and a discreet little siren box mounted just above the back gate. I tested everything twice. When Gloria or one of her lackeys set foot near my property again, the neighborhood would know it. At around 6, while I was tightening the last bracket on a floodlight, I heard a slow car crawl past. I didn't have to look. Gloria drove a dull beige Lincoln that moved like it hated acceleration. Sure enough, it coasted by my driveway, pausing just long enough for me to catch a glimpse of her oversized sunglasses and that tight, judgmental mouth. She didn't wave. I waved anyway. I figured that was the last I'd hear from her for a bit. I was wrong. 2 nights later, at exactly 11:23, the sirens screamed like a freight train. Rocco went nuts on the porch, barking and spinning in circles. I bolted out the back door barefoot, grabbing the metal flashlight by the grill as I ran. The yard was lit up like a prison yard. 2 figures were frozen in place by the floodlights, Deanne and Lyle. Deanne was shielding her face, while Lyle fumbled at something in his jacket pocket. They looked like raccoons caught raiding a vending machine. "You really don't learn, do you?" I said, stepping into the light. They didn't answer. Deanne pointed at the smokehouse. "That structure's in clear violation of Code 12.4b, she said. "We're performing an emergency verification." "You're not performing anything," I said. "You're trespassing again." Lyle held out a folded paper. "We're authorized by the board." I took it and glanced at it, a printed document with the HOA letterhead and Gloria's signature. "This isn't a warrant," I said. "This is a memo from Gloria. That doesn't give you the right to enter private property at night." Lyle stiffened. "We have jurisdiction." "No, you don't," I said, "and this time." "You're not walking away." I pointed toward the corner of the yard, where a red light blinked steadily on one of the cameras. "You're both on tape again, and this time it's not just footage, it's audio too. I've got every word." Deanne looked like she wanted to vanish into the grass. Lyle opened his mouth, then closed it. I already called the police, I said. They'll be here in 5. Lyle scoffed, but it was weak. He tried to step past me toward the smokehouse, but I blocked him. You take one more step and it's breaking and entering. He hesitated. Then the sirens in the distance started up, real ones. The kind that come with flashing lights and badges. They turned and bolted through the side gate just as 2 squad cars pulled up at the curb. I met the officers at the end of my driveway, still barefoot, still pulsing with adrenaline. They ran around the corner, I told them. Caught them trespassing for the 2nd time this week. All of it's on camera. One officer headed down the street in pursuit. The other stayed with me taking notes. What were they looking for? He asked. They say my smokehouse violates HOA code, I said. It doesn't. I filed the plans. They're just mad I didn't wait for the board to rubber stamp it. You have footage of them entering your property, multiple angles. I'll copy it for you, he nodded. If they entered without permission and under false authority, that's criminal trespass. Possibly impersonating a public official too, depending on how that memo was phrased. I handed him the paper Lyle gave me. He read it, then gave a low whistle. Yeah. They're in trouble. By morning, word had already spread. Gloria must have gotten wind of the arrest because she called an emergency board meeting and sent out notices by hand. A neighbor texted me to say she looked less like a queen and more like a cornered librarian. I didn't go to the meeting. Instead, I sent a copy of the footage to the board's legal counsel and attached a formal complaint citing sections of the state's property protection laws. I also copied in the city zoning office. If they wanted to play legal chicken, I was happy to meet them in court. The next day, I got a knock on the door. It was Officer Ramirez, the same one who took my statement. Just wanted to let you know, he said. We brought in both individuals for questioning. They admitted to entering without consent, claimed they were doing it under HOA direction. Let me guess, I said. Directed by Gloria, exactly. The memo they carried was intentionally worded to sound like it carried legal weight. That's not just trespassing, that's dangerously close to fraud. Is she being charged? We're investigating. The DA's office is reviewing the evidence now. It helps that you had everything documented. Honestly, if more people had cameras like yours, we'd have fewer headaches. He handed me a card. Keep in touch if anything else happens, and good job staying calm. Most people would have chased them off with a baseball bat. After he left, I sat on the porch with Rocco and scrolled through the neighborhood forum. It was chaos. Posts were flying, half the neighborhood demanding a board audit, the other half arguing over bylaws. Several people asked where they could buy the same floodlight system I used. I didn't post anything. I didn't need to. The video was already circulating. Someone had uploaded the clip from my security footage while shielding his face, Deanne stammering something about emergency code compliance, then the sirens and their panicked retreat. The comment section was brutal. By sunset, a petition was circulating to recall Gloria and dissolve the current board. It had over 60 signatures and climbing. I made popcorn. That evening, as I was locking up, I noticed a folded note had been slipped into my mailbox. It wasn't signed. You've made your point. But you're not done with us yet. I held it up to the porch light, game on. The following week, the neighborhood simmered like a pot with the lid clamped tight. Nobody said anything directly to me, but every time I walked Rocco, blinds twitched. A few neighbors gave me wide-eyed nods. Others looked away like I'd started a war they weren't sure they wanted to be caught in. By Thursday, I had received a formal envelope from a local law office, one I recognized from the HOA's quarterly newsletters. Inside was a cease and desist letter, accusations of defamation, and a demand that I take down the video circulating online. The letter claimed I had violated the HOA's reputation rights and that further distribution would result in legal escalation. I read it twice, then placed it neatly in a folder labeled Desperation Moves. At lunch, I drove downtown to meet with a friend of mine, Carl. He worked as an investigator for the county district attorney's office. I slid the cease and desist across the table. They're trying to bluff, Carl said without looking up from his sandwich. No such thing as reputation rights in this context, but I'll tell you what is interesting. We've had complaints about this HOA before. Nothing concrete, just whispers. But now you've got footage, a fake authorization, and a paper trail. That's a different animal. I leaned in. How far can this go? That depends, he said, picking at the corner of the letter. If the president issued this memo to impersonate legal authority, that's already bad. But if she's been using her position to coerce residents or tamper with property access, that can push into criminal conspiracy. I handed him a USB stick, every camera angle, audio included, plus a scanned copy of the original plans I submitted. I also pulled public property records. They've been citing code on buildings that aren't even under the HOA's jurisdiction. Carl pocketed the stick. I'll pass this along. If there's something buried here, we'll dig it up. That night, while Rocco snored under the coffee table, I reviewed the HOA's own bylaws paragraph by paragraph. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. A clause buried under a section titled Emergency Compliance Protocols. It granted the board certain rights in imminent hazard situations, but only if authorized by a majority vote and with law enforcement present. I double-checked the board meeting minutes for the month. No vote. No mention of any emergency. I printed it all out and mailed copies to the county's Civil Oversight Committee, the City Council Liaison, and the local homeowners' rights organization. Then I posted a new notice on the community bulletin board. HOA emergency powers and your rights know the law. I didn't sign it. The next morning, a few cars slowed when passing my house. One driver gave me a thumbs up through the window. Another neighbor, a retired firefighter named Vince, stopped while I was trimming the hedges. You're making waves, he said. Is that a warning or a compliment? Bit of both, he said with a dry chuckle. But keep going. A lot of us have been waiting for someone to push back. Later that afternoon, I got a call from Carl. We've got something, he said. Turns out, your HOA president has been submitting altered records to the county zoning office. Filing plans that don't match what's physically built, then using those fake submissions to issue violations. He paused. And it's not just your property. We've identified at least 7 others. One guy 2 blocks down had a pergola they claimed was non-compliant. We pulled the actual permit. It was approved 6 months before they cited him. They used that violation to place a lien on his property. I felt my grip tighten on the phone. That's fraud. Exactly. We're opening a formal investigation. With your footage and the memo, we can probably bring charges for falsifying public records, criminal trespass, and impersonation of authority. Possibly more, depending on what else we find. Do you need anything else from me? Stay available. And keep documenting everything. I hung up and immediately went to check my mailbox. This time, instead of a note, there was a sealed manila envelope. No postage. Hand-delivered. Inside were printed screenshots of my security footage, each one circled in red marker. At the bottom, in shaky handwriting, "You're not the only one watching." I scanned my front yard. A sedan I didn't recognize was parked 3 houses down. The driver was pretending to look at his phone, but his eyes flicked up when I moved. I walked back inside and activated the new perimeter recording function on my system. It logged every vehicle on the street and uploaded the footage to a cloud server I'd set up off-site. I wasn't taking chances. By Monday, things escalated. Carl called again, this time from a restricted number. They tried to interfere with the investigation, he said. Someone from the board contacted a clerk at the zoning office, asking her to adjust some of the digital records. She reported it. Please tell me you caught them. We have audio, and we're issuing subpoenas tomorrow. I wouldn't be surprised if we see arrests before the end of the week. I didn't have time to celebrate. That evening, a neighbor named Cassidy knocked on my door. She looked pale and shaken. They came to my house, she said. 2 board members. They said if I didn't retract my signature from the recall petition, they'd audit my landscaping project, said it might violate drainage rules. They threatened you. Not directly, she said, wringing her hands, but it was clear. They stood on my porch and wouldn't leave until I told them I'd think about it. One of them had a clipboard, kept writing things down. I pulled out my phone. You need to report that right now, she nodded. I just didn't think it would get this ugly. I contacted Carl again. He told me to document Cassidy's story and have her write a statement. Then I called Vince and 2 others I trusted. Within 24 hours, 6 residents had come forward with almost identical encounters, thinly veiled threats, clipboard inspections, and citations pulled out of thin air. Thursday arrived like a hammer. At 7 in the morning, 3 unmarked cars rolled into the neighborhood, followed by a patrol cruiser. Officers walked straight to Gloria's house, knocked once, and entered. She came out 10 minutes later in a beige sweater set, hands cuffed in front of her, lips pressed tight like she bit into a lemon. The 2 board members who trespassed with her were picked up shortly after. One tried to claim he was just following orders. The other kept asking if this would affect his pension. Turns out he worked for the local tax assessor's office. That opened a whole new can of worms. By evening, the neighborhood was buzzing. No one spoke in whispers anymore. They came out of their houses, gathered in driveways, traded stories. I learned about a couple who'd been fined for wind chimes. Another family had been told their wheelchair ramp violated visual harmony. Every one of them had been too afraid to fight back. I didn't give a speech. I didn't need to. The footage, the arrests, the legal notices, it all spoke for itself. The next day, the entire board resigned. A temporary committee was formed made up of residents who actually lived in the neighborhood and didn't own clipboards. Cassidy volunteered, so did Vince, and me. Our first act, we passed a motion requiring all board correspondence to be made public and archived. Second, we eliminated the emergency compliance clause entirely. Third, we hired an independent auditor to review every citation issued in the last 2 years. We found over 50 fabricated violations. Gloria's trial is scheduled for the fall. The DA added charges of property fraud, falsifying municipal records, and harassment. She's facing serious time. As for me, I replaced the floodlights with garden lanterns. The sirens are still up, but they haven't gone off since. Rocco still barks at squirrels, but not much else. The street's quiet now. And for the first time in years, people wave when they pass my house. Cassidy stood at the front of the newly formed community committee, holding a clipboard that didn't look like it belonged to someone preparing to threaten anyone. She wasn't wearing a cardigan or pearls, just jeans and a windbreaker. Her voice was steady as she addressed the crowd gathered in folding chairs on the community lawn. We've reviewed nearly all of the files, and I'll say this plainly. The previous board engaged in patterns of abuse that go far beyond citation errors. Vince stood beside her, arms folded, a legal-sized folder tucked under one elbow. His voice carried as he took over. There's something else you all need to know. The county's investigation uncovered financial irregularities, serious ones. HOA dues were being funneled into a private account not registered to the HOA. That account was traced to Gloria's name, and we now know she used some of those funds to pay for renovations on a property she owns in another city. Murmurs erupted across the crowd, sharp and confused. I stood toward the back, arms crossed, watching the faces turn from disbelief to outrage in real time. She embezzled from us. Someone called out. Cassidy didn't flinch. Yes. And she didn't do it alone. Turns out, the HOA treasurer, a man named Stewart who never once appeared at a board meeting in person, had been filing duplicate budgets for years. One for residents, another submitted to the county. The discrepancies were buried deep, but once uncovered, they painted a clear picture. Dues had been inflated, then skimmed. The fake violations, those were often used to justify the inflated fees. I stepped forward and raised my voice just enough to catch attention. How much money are we talking? Vince opened the folder and read from a document inside. Over $74,000 over a span of 4 years, and that's just what we've confirmed so far. The crowd was silent for a moment. Then came the questions. Can we get it back? Is she going to prison? What about our home values? Cassidy raised a hand. The DA's office is pursuing charges of wire fraud, embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy. Gloria and Stewart are both currently out on bond, but the case is moving quickly. If convicted, they'll face substantial prison time. What about restitution? Asked a woman near the front, holding a baby on her hip. There's a civil suit underway. The county is assisting in freezing assets. We're not guaranteeing full recovery, but the goal is to recoup as much as possible and return it to the HOA fund. That night, the community lawn stayed lit long after the meeting ended. Neighbors milled around, talking with one another instead of retreating behind closed doors. For the first time since I'd bought the house, people weren't just tolerating each other, they were collaborating. The next morning, I was back in my garage, organizing the last of the documents I'd contributed to the investigation when an unfamiliar car pulled up to the driveway. A man stepped out, wearing a pressed gray suit and a badge clipped to his belt. "You Elliot," I nodded. He held out a manila envelope. "Court summons. You're being called as a witness in the case against Gloria Hartley. The DA wants you to testify regarding the surveillance footage and your documentation of the board's actions." I signed for the envelope and opened it after he left. The trial date was officially set. 2 weeks from Monday. I didn't hesitate. I called Carl and told him I'd testify. When I entered the courthouse on the day of the trial, I didn't expect to see so many familiar faces. Nearly 24 neighbors had turned out, some in support, others as witnesses themselves. Gloria sat at the defense table, her posture rigid, her lawyer whispering in her ear between statements. She didn't look at me once. The prosecution built the case with surgical precision. They began with the trespassing incidents, playing the footage in open court, the sirens, the flash of motion-triggered lights, Deanne's voice saying emergency verification like she was in a police procedural. Then came the forged documents. The memo Gloria had signed was compared to the HOA's actual emergency compliance procedures, which contained no such authority. An expert from the county zoning office testified that permits had been altered digitally by Stewart, using a login that hadn't been authorized in over a year. By the time it was my turn to take the stand, the courtroom was already heavy with the weight of what had been exposed. The prosecutor didn't waste time. "Mr. Elliot, can you describe what led you to install the surveillance and security features on your property?" I kept my voice calm. After repeated unannounced visits from members of the HOA board, including one instance in the middle of the night, I installed motion sensors, floodlights, and a siren system to discourage further unauthorized access. I also had reason to believe the board was targeting my property unfairly. And did those measures capture any unusual activity? Yes. The board members returned at night, entered my yard without permission, and attempted to inspect a structure they claimed was in violation despite no legal authority to do so. Were you able to confirm whether the structure was in violation? Yes, it was not. I had submitted plans in advance, and the structure complied with all city and HOA regulations. Did the board acknowledge those submitted plans? No. They claimed they never received them despite a delivery confirmation and email receipt. The opposing counsel tried to discredit my testimony, but the video footage, time-stamped emails, and physical documentation held up. There wasn't much they could do against evidence that thorough. After 3 days of testimony, the verdict came in guilty on all counts: wire fraud, criminal trespass, falsification of public documents. Gloria was sentenced to 8 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 5. Stewart received 6 years and was ordered to pay restitution through asset liquidation, including the sale of his property. The HOA fund received a court-mandated reimbursement of $52,000. Cassidy and the new committee used part of it to contract an outside firm to audit the neighborhood infrastructure and ensure compliance going forward. The rest was put into a transparency fund. Every dollar spent now had to be logged publicly. In the months that followed, the neighborhood changed in ways I didn't expect. The fences came down, not literally, but the emotional ones. People knocked on each other's doors again. Vince started hosting cookouts on the first Saturday of every month. Cassidy organized a spring cleanup and actually got volunteers. One family who'd been fined for their daughter's chalk drawings on the sidewalk now ran a weekend art booth for kids at the park. The floodlights stayed up. But not as a warning anymore, just a reminder of what happens when people let power go unchecked. Rocco still sat on the porch in the evenings. his ears perking up only when kids raced past on bikes or someone dropped a burger on Vince's grill. As for me, I joined the new HOA Oversight Council reluctantly at first, but it turned out I didn't hate it. We didn't have power, we had responsibilities, and that made all the difference. Gloria's house went up for sale 6 weeks after her sentencing. A young couple bought it. They planted sunflowers in the yard and never once mentioned architectural harmony. I still have the envelope that was slipped into my mailbox, the one that said I wasn't done with them yet. Turns out, they were the ones who were finished, and we were just getting started.